I started by trimming off the end of this post and then cutting out roughly a square section. And then I set it up on the router table just between two flat level pieces of aluminium extrusion and used that to face plane the bottom of the block with the router just to get one flat face to start with. And then using that flat face directly on the table saw, I could get the edges 90 degrees to that flat face. Once I set the measurement up, the final measurement that I wanted, I just ran the block through, got two parallel edges, and then using my sled, I could do the third edge without having to move the fence, which meant that when I ran the block through for the fourth edge, the fence was in the same spot and the block ended up exactly square. Then I repeated the process again. This time what I did, I took a height measurement of the block and I wanted the block to be about 40 millimeters in thickness, so whatever that height was, I just minus 40 millimeters, set the router bit to that depth and then face planed the other side, and that gave me a block 40 millimeters thick that was perfectly square, flat and parallel to itself on all edges and faces. Using a piece of sandpaper glued to a flat board, I could take out any machine marks while still keeping all the faces dead flat. Then using the chamfer bit on the router, I just eased off all the sharp edges. Next I just found the centre of the block by crossing the diagonals, marked the centre, and then after measuring the shaft on the clock mechanism, found the right drill bit, which was actually happened to be an 8mm brad point bit, and drilled out the centre hole for the clock mechanism to come through. I then traced out the clock shape on the back of the block and used those marks to basically remove the bulk of the material with a Forstner bit before taking it to the router table. Then by just eyeing off the pencil marks with the edge of the router bit, I could create this setup which basically acted like 4 stop blocks, which would allow me to accurately finish routing out the back of the block to fit the clock mechanism. I used the roundover bit on the square edges of that cutout, which would allow me to raise the router bit a little higher to get the right depth that I wanted. To mark out where the hour indicators are going to go on the clock, what I've done first of all is I've just crisscrossed the block, as you can see there, using the tri-square or the engineer square. And then what I did is I just went to the internet and I printed off a 12 segmented circle. I printed it slightly larger than what I needed, and then with the compass I drew this inside circle, and that's where my points are actually going to be. The reason why I drew it slightly larger and then cut it down was just for alignment purposes. So now I can use those 4 points there, as you can see. If I just bring that across like that, yeah, that looks perfect. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just put some tape here, a bit of tape here. That should be enough to keep it in place, just so I can mark those points. The hour markers on the clock are going to be made from solid brass. I'm going to use this 6mm brass rod. So using a 6mm brad point bit, I drilled out the hour marks. Now I set the depth gauge on my drill press, and I think I drilled them down to about 6mm.
to be able to repeatedly cut this consistently at the same length, what I did was I just made up this very simple jig. So what I did there, I drilled a 1/4 inch hole, so it allows for a little bit of clearance. Slide the threaded rod, the brass rod inside there, and that hole goes about 7 millimeters past this cut line here. And I'm going to cut through the rod using my hacksaw in that slot. And what I did underneath was I drilled out a large hole with the Forstner bit, and what that will do is once I've cut through the rod, it'll let that little piece just fall out, which keeps the jig clear all the time, and I can continue cutting and cutting until I've got my 12 pieces. Then I just have to pick them up all off the floor.
I needed a way of being able to chamfer one end of these lengths of brass on the disc sander just to make it easier for them to go into the holes in the block, but there's no way I could have held them with my fingers, so I just came up with this. I drilled a hole in the end of a length of dowel, tapped it in, and it actually worked out quite fine. Using that same flat board with the sandpaper glued to it, which actually was 100 grit emery cloth, I sanded down the brass hour markers just flush with the face of the clock. I gave the whole thing a quick sand with some 320 grit paper, blew off all the dust, and gave it a coat of clear water-based varnish. After the first coat had dried, I gave it a quick sand with some 320 again and gave it a final coat, so I ended up with 2 coats. Now it was just time to put the clock together.